Do you have a few, or maybe more than a few, unfinished quilt tops or flimsies sitting around right now? I get it. Whether you have a big machine like mine or a more modest sewing machine like Connor's, machine quilting can feel overwhelming, dealing with stops and starts and thread ends, wrestling the bulk of the quilt through your machine, and wondering if you're doing it right. Hi, I'm Beth Ann, and today I'm sharing walking foot techniques that can help you get over that hump and eliminate most of that stress. You can quilt almost any beginner quilt project beautifully with just these three techniques. And you can use straight lines, simple decorative stitches like this serpentine stitch, or gentle freeform curves. Technique number one, channel quilting. Now, channel quilting is just a fancy name for stitching parallel lines, usually, but not always, spaced equal distances apart. A quick tip as we get rolling, consider lengthening your stitch just a little bit, like from 2.0 to 2.5, or if your default is 2.5, maybe to 3. This can often give you a smoother, nicer looking stitch on a thick quilt sandwich. You can use the edge of your presser foot as a guide to space the lines close together on something like this table runner, or you can use a guide bar with your walking foot to help you space your lines evenly on a wider bed quilt like this. You can even stitch on the diagonal. Want to fancy it up a bit while still keeping it easy? Decorative stitches like this serpentine stitch can add texture and visual interest. Here I'm using painter's tape as a guide for spacing out my stitching lines. On a block quilt, I often start by using the seam lines as my guide, starting from the midline and working towards the edge of the quilt, and then rotating the quilt and stitching towards the other edge. This method reduces the amount of bulk going through your machine at any given time and makes it a lot easier. And if I want to keep going, I insert another line in between those lines. And here's a close-up of the finished quilt. The curvy serpentine stitch creates a lovely texture. You can also choose to stitch gentle freeform curves that echo each other like this, or you can allow them to overlap each other for an organic, flowing look. That's how I chose to quilt my autumn table runner from the tutorial back in October. Here's a close-up. Can you see how sometimes the curvy lines run next to each other and sometimes they cross? It's easy to do, and it creates a graceful, flowing movement. And there's no worries about thread ends for any of the techniques that we'll talk about today, since each stitching line starts and stops in the batting around the outer edges of the quilt. And here's another important tip for all of these techniques. Start with a placemat, a table runner, a pillow cover, or any other small project of your choice. Seriously, before you tackle a queen-size quilt, practice machine quilting on something more manageable. These small projects can help you practice and build up your confidence. As I mentioned earlier, I often start along the midline of the quilt and work towards the outer edges, which is the way quilters are typically taught. But if you've pin basted, there may be times when it's easier to start on or near the outer edges and work in. As long as everything is well basted and the layers are secure, that's perfectly okay. So here we have our first set of designs. Once you're comfortable with straight or gently curved lines, we can take this to the next level with a technique that's really fun on geometric pieced quilts. Technique 2 is echo quilting, and this one's a classic for good reason. It gives us structure and movement without being complicated, and following the seams means there's little to no marking needed. We can start stitching right away. The first stage is a lot like channel quilting, but the spacing is determined by the spacing of the long seam lines that run through the quilt. We don't need to stitch next to every seam. We're looking for seams that run all the way or most of the way through the quilt. Since I stitched the vertical lines first, the next stage is the horizontal lines. Here's a close-up. As you can see, I'm stitching about 1/4 of an inch away from the seams. With echo quilting, it doesn't matter if you've pressed your seam allowances open or to one side. It works either way. If you look closely, you'll see stretches where I've stitched across sections where the long seam lines are interrupted, and I've used these red ovals to show you. It's perfectly fine to stitch across fabrics to keep a continuous line from edge to edge. And here's a close-up of the finished quilt. It's a classic look. Now let's take a look at this quilt. Once again, I'm going to ignore the half square triangles and focus on the long seam lines that run throughout the quilt. If you follow both the horizontal and the vertical seams, the stitching naturally forms a beautiful grid. The stitching highlights the piecing without competing with it. The same edge-to-edge principle applies here. Start each line at one edge of the quilt, stitch across, and end on the opposite edge in the batting. You can even extend the lines into any borders you might have added to your quilt. Doesn't mean you have to, but you could, and it keeps it easier because there's no thread ends to worry about. Now here's where it gets even more fun. If you're quilting squares or square-based blocks, this technique gives you instant drama with minimal planning. This quilt was made and quilted by my friend Mary Curis. For this technique, we'll stitch diagonal lines across square pieces from corner to corner, first in one direction, like channel quilting, and then we'll stitch across the blocks in the opposite direction. Notice how Mary used those larger white spaces as her guides. She completely skipped the little 4-patch blocks. Yeah, this quilt has been used and washed and loved for years, and it's holding up just great. Now, if you want to fancy it up a bit, you can add echo lines parallel to your initial diagonal grid to create a lovely modern lattice. And you can even experiment with decorative stitches here, too. Isn't that just lovely? The gently curving quilting really softens the geometric lines of the piecing. And what about a quilt like this? It's a block quilt that features very strong diagonals in the piecing. I plan to echo quilt on either side of the seam lines between the blocks, and then along the strong diagonal lines that run across the quilt. Now, whenever you're combining stitching that's on the lengthwise or crosswise grain with stitching on the bias, it's generally best to stitch the on-grain lines first so they can help stabilize your quilt sandwich. The bias lines are going to be potentially a little bit stretchier. So if you do those second, it's less likely to stretch. Once these techniques feel natural, you'll be amazed at how much of your quilting you can do quickly and confidently. So how do you know when you're ready to graduate from small pieces to larger quilts? Let's consider some confidence checkpoints. Any of these has the potential to trip you up, so let's be on the lookout. Are you comfortable installing and using your walking foot or dual feed system? Let's do a quick review on Connor's machine. The design of your particular walking foot might vary a little bit, but it's probably similar. First, we have to remove the presser foot and shank. So that's what I'm doing here. Once I get that out of the way, here it comes. I got to hang on to that screw. Then we'll grab the walking foot and check to make sure that the little claw, and you might have a lever instead of a claw, but either way, it needs to go around or above the needle bar because that's what will allow the foot to grab and move the quilt through the machine. Then tighten the screw so the foot is sitting nice and straight. and the feed dogs align with the feed dogs in the machine. Now it's ready to go. And if your walking foot came with a little metal guide bar, dig it out. Once it's clicked in properly, usually at the back of the walking foot, it can be incredibly helpful for keeping even spacing between your quilting lines. Depending on the model you have, you may be able to use the bar only on one side of the foot, or you may be able to switch it back and forth. Here I'm showing the bar on the left of my walking foot. The dual feed system for my machine looks a little different from Connor's. This part needs to plug into the back of the machine. This lever needs to be positioned so that the belt is in contact with the fabric. And I can swap out these presser feet depending on what I'm doing. Be sure to consult your sewing machine manual for specific guidance. But for the purposes of this video, both styles do the same essential job, keeping your quilt layers moving freely through your machine for pucker-free, tuck-free stitching. Let's consider a few more crucial points. Can you quilt a small project without major puckers or ripples? Batting and basting choices can also be factors here, so I'll link these videos in the description box. The first is all about quilt basting with safety pins, and the second is all about basting spray. Are your straight lines reasonably straight and even? Are your curves reasonably smooth? None of these lines have to be perfect. Do you notice I said reasonably? Do you feel comfortable feeding the quilt sandwich through your machine? These 3 checkpoints are all related. Beyond practice, here's a crucial tip that can be a help. If you're pushing or pulling to get a quilt through the machine, something is wrong. Keep enough slack in front of the presser foot so the presser foot can grab the top layer and the machine grab the bottom layer at the same time and pull everything through evenly. You want to kind of present the quilt to the machine, not drag it up over the edge or force it through. It's also really helpful if you have a table or something else behind your machine to catch the quilt as it comes out so that the weight of the quilt isn't pulling against the presser foot. If you'd like additional guidance and encouragement for handling the bulk of the quilt in your machine, both on small quilts and large quilts, on small machines and large machines, be sure to check out this video. I'll drop a link in the description and at the end of this one. If you're answering yes to these questions, you're ready to go bigger. If not yet, it's completely normal. But if you answered yes to even 1 or 2 of these, you're already making progress. Don't underestimate that. Keep practicing on small pieces until the movement feels easy and natural. Now you have 3 walking foot quilting techniques that can help you finish your quilts quickly and happily. Channel quilting for versatility, echo quilting for accenting and complementing the seam lines in your quilts, and corner to corner for creating gorgeous diagonal lines, grids, and lattices. If this video was helpful, please let me know in the comments. I share new tutorials and tips every week, so feel free to subscribe and keep learning with me. And if you try 1 or more of these techniques, I'd love to hear how it goes. Happy quilting!